Jesus thought that he would be the king in the kingdom of God. He put himself in God's place by his words and actions. But then you see, it makes no sense at all to think that Jesus thought that somebody else was going to come who would judge the world and who would presumably judge Jesus himself. Someone to whom Jesus would be submitted as if he were merely human prophet. Jesus' unsurpassed sense of divine authority is incompatible with the view that he thought somebody else was the coming Son of Man who would judge mankind and Jesus himself. So, in summary then, I think it's very clear that there are good reasons to reject EHRMAN'S interpretation that although Jesus used the expression Son of Man, he wasn't talking about himself, but about somebody else. Finally, the last point that I want to make in my critique of EHRMAN is to say something about his views on the resurrection of Jesus. Although Dr. EHRMAN says that there cannot be any historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, what he really means, I think, is that the resurrection cannot be the best explanation of the evidence. Not that there is no evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. And let me see if I've got this on the PowerPoint for my... Yes, there's two basic contentions or moves in constructing a case for the resurrection. First, that there are four historical facts which must be explained by any historical hypothesis: the burial, the empty tomb, the post-mortem appearances, and the origin of the disciples' belief in his resurrection. Second, then, is to show that the best explanation of these facts is that Jesus rose from the dead. And although EHRMAN says there's no evidence for the resurrection, in fact, he doesn't dispute point one. What he really means is point two, is that the best explanation of the evidence cannot be the resurrection. Let's go to the next slide, please. This is a part about the problem of miracles. Okay, I don't think we're going to have time to go through all of this because of our time constraints. So let me just skip ahead, and I simply want to make this point. With respect to that first major point, if we can go back a couple of slides. Yes, to this one. EHRMAN actually agrees with all four of those facts that I mentioned. And again, here's the difference between the good Bart and the bad Bart. The good Bart, in his scholarly lectures, admits all four of these facts. The bad Bart, in his public debates, tries to cast doubt upon these by saying, oh, the narratives are filled with contradictions and uncertainties, the number of angels at the tomb, the names of the women that went to the tomb, whether they went when the sun was risen, whether they went when it was still dark, what did they do after they saw the angel? Did they go tell the disciples? Did they tell no one? And he gives the impression to lay people that the narratives are so hopelessly contradictory that they cannot be believed in their historical core. And I lost all respect for Bart EHRMAN, frankly, when I saw in public debate how he deliberately and deceptively tries to mislead laymen about this. Because in his scholarly work, the good Bart knows that despite these inconsistencies and contradictions, nevertheless, the core facts that I have listed are credibly established. Here's what Bart EHRMAN says in his lectures on the historical Jesus with the teaching company. He says, there are a couple of things that we can say for certain about Jesus after his death. We can say with relative certainty, for example, that he was buried. The accounts are fairly unanimous in saying, the earliest accounts we have are unanimous in saying, that Jesus was in fact buried by this fellow Joseph of Arimathea. And so it's relatively reliable that that's what happened. We also have solid traditions to indicate that women found this tomb empty 3 days later. This is attested in all of our gospel sources, early and late, and so it appears to be a historical datum. And so I think we can say that after Jesus' death, probably with some certainty, that he was buried, possibly by this fellow Joseph of Arimathea, and that 3 days later he appeared not to have been in the tomb. He also acknowledges the earliest disciples saw appearances of Jesus and that they came to believe that Jesus was risen from the dead. So the good Bart recognizes that even given all the inconsistencies and contradictions in the narrative, the 4 fundamental facts remain firmly historically established. So, what EHRMAN'S real problem with the resurrection is in saying the resurrection cannot be the best explanation. Well, why not? Well, the reason is because the resurrection is a miraculous explanation, and he says historians cannot adopt a miraculous explanation as the best explanation. Now, how can I handle this best here? Let's go to the slide that is called EHRMAN'S egregious error. Can you go to that one? EHRMAN'S egregious error. Okay, here's EHRMAN'S egregious error. This is the quotation here. Because historians can only establish what probably happened, and a miracle of this nature is highly improbable, the historian cannot say it probably occurred. Now, to the lay person, that sounds really plausible, doesn't it? Because historians can only establish what probably happened, and a miracle of this nature is highly improbable, the historian cannot say it probably occurred. This is just David Hume's old argument against the identification of miracles warmed over. And the fallacy is this, that the only factor he considers in assessing the probability of the resurrection hypothesis is, in red, the probability of the resurrection on our background information, B. He's saying a miracle is inherently improbable because relative to our background information of the world, dead men do not rise from the dead. And so that makes the resurrection hypothesis intrinsically improbable. But what he fails to understand is that the probability calculus for accounting for the resurrection hypothesis is not just the probability of the resurrection on the background information, but also the probability of the resurrection on the background information and the evidence E. And the evidence E will be things like the empty tomb, the post-mortem appearances, and the origin of the disciples' belief in his resurrection. And so what EHRMAN concludes is that because the probability of R on B is low, therefore the probability of R on B and E is low. And that's just mathematically, demonstrably fallacious. It only considers one factor in the probability calculus. You also have to figure what is the probability of the evidence given the background information in the resurrection, and what is the probability of Jesus not rising from the dead on the background information, and the probability of the evidence of the empty tomb, the post-mortem appearances, and the origin of the disciples' faith, given our background information and the fact that Jesus did not rise from the dead. And the bottom line is that when you compute all those other factors, it is perfectly plausible and possible for the probability of the resurrection on the background information and the evidence to be very high, even though the probability of R on B is very low. The probability of the resurrection on the background information and the evidence can be very high, even though the probability of the resurrection on the background information alone is very low. And that is EHRMAN'S egregious error, as I've called it, is thinking that because the probability of R on B is low, therefore the probability of the resurrection is low. And that just is a fallacious inference. Let me go to the slide, Bart's blunder. Bart's blunder. Here's an even more egregious error. And he repeats these errors over and over again in his writings. It's just shocking. Okay, Bart's blunder. Since historians can establish only what probably happened in the past, They cannot show that miracles happened, since this would involve a contradiction. Namely, the most improbable event is the most probable. So it would be a contradiction to show the resurrection happened, because that would be to show that the most improbable event is the most probable event. In fact, there's no contradiction at all, because you're talking about two different probabilities. One would be the probability of the resurrection on the background information, which would be perhaps very low. The other probability is the probability of the resurrection on the background information and the evidence, and that probability could be very high. So there's no contradiction at all.